Have black and white South Africans reconciled? Does the National Day of Reconciliation mean anything to the majority of South Africans? Did the Truth and Reconciliation Commission reconcile South Africans? Is Nelson Mandela's legacy of reconciliation gone and forgotten with the men? What time is it? It's question time. Welcome to the show. The 2014 edition of the South African Reconciliation Barometer, published by the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation, shows that South Africans have grown more disillusioned by the notion of a rainbow nation and instead see race as a salient aspect of their identity. Further, South Africans appear to be forgetting just how dire things were under apartheid. 20 years into democracy on this National Day of Reconciliation, have South Africans reconciled? My guests today are Dr. Leon Wessels, former commissioner of the South African Human Rights Commission. Babu Mabasa is the president of the Socialist Party of Azania. And Minki Maristatler, head of media and public affairs at South African Institute of Race Relations. Welcome to the show. We were just talking earlier about a couple of things, but before we go into the show, let us firstly have a look at the sunset.
16 December is now known as the Day of Reconciliation. The day is of great political significance in South Africa's history. In an effort to address South Africa's apartheid-driven racial past, a court-like restorative justice body, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, was assembled after the abolition of apartheid. Despite some shortcomings, the TRC has been hailed as having been genuinely successful in paving the way for national tolerance and reconciliation. As we mark this year's events, the country is still faced by the triple challenges of unemployment, poverty, and inequality, particularly among black people, women, and the youth. The question of land and true economic empowerment continue to face the ANC-led government's second phase of transition. But the question remains, how can all South Africans be encouraged to be more tolerant of one another?
That was an inset prepared for us by our producer, Nandin Lazi. Welcome once again to the show. Dr. Wessels, we were just talking earlier on about aspects that can be used to evaluate if indeed reconciliation has occurred in South Africa. What is your take in as far as reconciliation is concerned in South Africa, 20 years into democracy?
Well, I believe we have moved a long distance, but I think we should have moved further. There are a number of reasons why we are not where one had hoped we would be. First of all, the whole notion of reconciliation beyond the TRC process let us down in many respects, because they, namely the TRC, had a very limited and a very tight framework in which to discharge their brief. Beyond that, reconciliation was never going to take care of itself. It had to be nurtured by South Africans. And the government of the day had to provide the climate and the atmosphere in which ordinary South Africans could continue to build bridges across the old divides. So in that respect, I believe we still have a long road to travel.
But had you expected miracles, within 20 years?
I wouldn't say miracles, but we certainly had very high hopes. For example...
Practical?
Absolutely practical.
Okay.
In many respects, we realized that the divide between South Africa goes way beyond the race issue.
Okay.
It also has to do with the equalities and the inequalities of our country. And one did not expect, that would have been unrealistic, that we would have fulfilled all the economic aspirations at the time. What we had hoped for was a clear communication as well as a clear buy-in from the broader South Africans to achieve this. I think where we stumbled was when we became so party political orientated that we not only lost sight of the national issues because we were so busy with with politics of the day.
Okay. Mr. Babas, you're very critical of the practicalities of reconciliation in South Africa.
No, I don't think you would be right to say the practicalities of reconciliation in South Africa. I think there was lost opportunities, and I would put it this way. I think South Africa wanted a birth without pain. Mm-hmm. Now, that is actually not likely. Somebody said real peace comes from the prevalence of justice. At the center, if you want peace and you do not pursue justice, the likelihood is that despite your good intention, you're going to fall or come a cropper. And I think that's what has happened in South Africa. Mm. We have a situation, and people, this is normal, it happens in our families, of a child who you say, please go and share with your brother. Mm. And he bites a big piece, and when he arrives, he still shares with them equally. And the reality is that then there are no changes, and that's what has happened. You talk about the economy, you talk about transformation, you'd find that in the main, those who have advantages continue to have advantages. And those who are disadvantaged find themselves in a situation of disadvantage. If the UNDP reports that in most cases, blacks are worse off than they have ever been under apartheid, it's basically because I think we wanted peace without justice. Had we chosen the way of justice, had we chosen to suffer maybe transient pain in order to achieve greater success in the future, I think we would have gone far. So my criticism is there that blacks still occupy the lowest rung of the economic ladder. They are homeless, they are landless in the main, and you can count these things. And when the struggle, they were both the subject and the object of the struggle, there was a way where white South Africans would have taken, without anybody cajoling them, that into consideration and say, how do we assist our fellow South Africans to go? But we just created new lagers now. There are white people there. They live in the air-conditioned suburbs, and there are blacks who live in Piri and other places, catching hell every day.
Mingi, you are researchers. What have you found in South Africa?
We've actually found what the both gentlemen have said something that we've found. For instance, we feel that it goes beyond the race issue. So we have seen racial goodwill actually decline slightly since 2009. And we've also seen that there's been obviously more inequality between those that are advantaged and those that are disadvantaged. And those that were disadvantaged before, some of them are even more disadvantaged now. And we've seen that. But what we believe is it comes down to policy, and that there are policies that maybe at their fruition, at the start, at their origins, were well meant to rectify previous disadvantage, to try and bring justice and make justice a reality, but they're not actually working. And the three areas that we've looked at in quite an intense way are education, labor legislation, and also empowerment legislation. And I can speak about that for quite a long time, but especially empowerment legislation, we find that as well-intentioned as BEE was, and as important as it is, we are calling for reform to start looking rather at people's income, at people's level of poverty.
Is this a class-based inequality?
We think that what has happened is that, yes, BE has definitely helped a black middle class rise. And when we say middle class, we don't mean people driving Jaguars or anything like that. We mean lower and upper middle class people. It means that you have a fridge or a television or access to DSTV or so forth.
Yeah.
And it's measured by living standards measurements. And we have actually seen about 82% increase in black people moving into the lower middle class, and more than a 300% increase into upper middle class. But those people, the elites, are getting richer, and the people right at the bottom are not benefiting.
We're going to talk about policies which could assist actually to ensure that there's reconciliation, but also look at other aspects that could encourage reconciliation. Only after the break. This is Question Time. Please don't go away.
Our new waterproof smartphone takes superior photos even in low light. Has PlayStation 4 remote play and up to 2 days battery life. Don't settle for good. Demand great. The new Sony Xperia Z3 series.
Welcome back. You're still watching Question Time. My guest today, Dr. Leon Wessels, former commissioner of the South African Human Rights Commission. Labun Mabasa is the president of the Socialist Party of Azania, and Mickey Maristatler is head media public affairs at the South Africa Institute of Race Relations. Dr. Wessels, do we have policies that encourage reconciliation in South Africa?
Let me say right at the outset that I, in my heart of heart, I'm still a constitutionalist and somebody who embraces the notion of a constitutional state, and a practitioner of human rights the 10 years that I spent at the Human Rights Commission. Within that ambit, you have to draft your policies, but policies are words on paper. It has to be accompanied also by an attitude. And an attitude embraces the notion of leadership and the service mentality. A Batu Pele principle, not a Runa Pele principle. Me first, the nation first, the people that I serve. And regardless of how good or how poor the policies are, if it is not accompanied by a service mentality. And I find in many respects that reconciliation, and once again, I'm not only focusing on the racial divides, I'm focusing on the broader picture of reconciliation. Reconciliation stumbles right there at the service desk, and it ends right there on the table of the leaders of our nation.
Minky, you seem to be agreeing.
We do think that attitude is very important, and that's also where we feel that true reconciliation can't happen if people don't feel that they have a legitimate place in our country. So if they are failed by the education system, 80% of our schools are dysfunctional, and if they don't have a job, you can talk about reconciliation as much as you like, but if you can't own your own house, go to work, feed your family, feel you have a legitimate place, then, and have that attitude, then true reconciliation can't happen. And therefore that attitude needs to be nurtured, and that can be done through education, and that can be done through reforming labor legislation and making it easier to employ people, and also skilling people up. So there's a lot of focus on university education, for example, which is very important. But we also say that what about vocational vocational education? What about looking at the sectors in our country like manufacturing, where people can actually, now some people take offense and say, yes, but you're talking about working in factories. Well, if you can work in a factory and not sit at home, and that factory job allows you to provide for your family, then why can't you have that job? Why is it so difficult to get one?
Some of us, this goes back to the class question, I guess.
Yeah, it does. And it's so, people are going to say, what's wrong with these socialists agreeing with these guys? But actually, I agree on the basis that it's a framework. It's a framework that is extremely problematic. If people are using a constitution, they probably use it as far as it can serve their need and not extend those needs to the people they are supposed to lead. And just the term reconciliation itself presupposes that there are certain things which are not right, which needs to be put right, which needs to be corrected. You cannot just use it as a term that, because if you take out of it the true meaning of reconciliation, you actually are working in a vacuum. If you talk reconciliation, you would have to ask, what are the areas? What are the things, and how do we do those things? From where I stand, I would say one of the major problems has been a framework chosen by government, which makes it very easy for government to be dictated upon. Because you see, if you say, I want to give people land, probably the IMF will come and say, no, you can't do it that way. If you say, I want to improve education and I want to spend a lot of money, they would say, please watch your fiscal policies. So it takes away the courage of those who want to change. And up till now, I think the present government has not, I'm sorry to say, they haven't shown that courage.
Now, you know, earlier we spoke about language. And although Afrikaans by many is viewed as a language of the oppressor, fact of the matter is, as you were saying, it is spoken more, or rather, the majority of the people who speak Afrikaans are actually not Afrikaners.
Yeah, I think it is true. There has been a certain level about the use of the word Afrikaans by a chauvinist group that happens to be white and who says this is our language, it's not a South African language. And as a result, like I was giving you, these are the people who would say, no, the who always cry Afrikaans, 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 but they are not actually crying Afrikaans, Africa. They want the maintenance of white privilege and position. They want to isolate themselves. They want to continue with the same framework they used under apartheid. That's why they cry so much about minorities, and they refuse to close the door of prejudice. The one Biko spoke about, that if that door is closed, certain things come on their own, they almost come automatically. So they perpetuate an idea that Afrikaans does not belong to South Africans, but it belongs to us alone. And the truth is that it's spoken by a lot of black people. It's even the lingua franca of the clevers in the location and so on. But the notion that it is ours, it needs to be protected from other people. We even have to have an Afrikaner state where we'll speak Afrikaans, that the culture is different from that of South Africans. It's, in my view, sick notion.
Well, I want to attack the problem, not to attack the arguments advanced, but I want to attack the problem from a slightly different angle, namely, that I don't believe in minority rights.
Just hold it there. I'll give you time to talk about that which you do not believe in only after the break.
Thank you.
Dr. Wessels does not believe in minority rights. We're still taking a quick break. Please don't go away.
In Parliament, Higher Education and Training Minister Bladen Nzimande has conceded that the bursary scheme is not enough to meet the growing demand from students.
Funding for universities is not enough. We'll be open about that. We will continue to ask for more from government as a department.
We've always said that the NSFAS budget must be 16 billion rand and that no qualifying student must be prevented from studying just because they cannot afford to do so.
There's been concern about citrus exports to Europe and investment contracts.
There are more opportunities for us to sell sugar, wine, ethanol, some fruit products than we had before, and that could create jobs.
That's business news, weekdays at 6 p.m. on SABC News.
Welcome back. You're still watching Question Time. My guest today, Dr. Leon Wessels, former commissioner of the South African Human Rights Commission. Labun Mabasa is the president of the Socialist Party of Azania. And Minki Mari Statler, head of public affairs and media at the South Africa Institute of Race Relations. Dr. Wessels, you do not believe in minority rights.
Yeah, if you define yourself as a minority, that is what you will be forever and ever in the future. So if you campaign for Afrikaans rights and Afrikaner rights, that is what you will be, a minority. Now, when the Constitution was crafted, the whole notion of languages and accommodating the languages and there being parity of esteem of languages is what I embrace. In other words, if I embrace multilingualism, I am on the side of the majority, regardless of how they look and regardless of the language they speak. So if the point advanced is a point where you say Afrikaans can not only be preserved by Afrikaners, I endorse that. It has to be owned by the South African nation, and that is where you will find protection for Afrikaans. But there is something that I also find extremely irritating. You will find some of the Afrikaner groupings that were referred to, they will cite Oliver Tambo, they will cite this one, and the next one who said on different podiums, different stadiums in their careers that this country cannot move forward without the Afrikaners and without Afrikaans. The question is this: how do we as Afrikaners and Afrikaans speakers reciprocate? In other words, if people hold Afrikaans in high regard, how do we respond to Tswana, to the Tswana speakers, to the Pedi speakers? How do we deal that? In other words, multilingualism and South Africanism does not exclude South African and Afrikaners.
Okay. You know, as you're saying that, I'm reminded of the fact that this day of reconciliation, its origins are actually not those of reconciliation, And if you today then sit back and say, what used to be a day confined or exclusive to Afrikaners and in pursuit of subjugation of the majority of black South Africans has now today become, a day of reconciliation. What does it then say?
Well, it says a lot of things, and it tells you inter alia that there are people who don't embrace this notion of reconciliation. Reconciliation at its heart has to do with accommodating one another, not tolerating one another, accommodating one another in the sense that we learn how to live with difference.
Afrikaners, or rather, let me say this, black people are extending their hand. Are Afrikaners meeting them halfway?
There are many Afrikaners that do meet them halfway. Undoubtedly so, and they have to be applauded. And I think we have reached the stage where reconciliation, the days of big debates about reconciliations has come and gone. It's the time and the moment has arrived for living and demonstrating reconciliation.
Minky, the fact that Nelson Mandela is held in such great esteem, does it still play, any role in reconciling South Africans?
I think it does. I think he is an important figure, not only to black South Africans, but to South Africans from not only whites, but Indian South Africans, coloured South Africans. And as you were saying with Afrikaans, if you think about the Northern Cape, it's probably the most widely spoken language there, and it's not white people speaking it. And I do think he plays a very important role, but I also think that, and what we think is that the responsibility is now with all South Africans. We can't keep looking at Nelson Mandela and expecting him to even through his legacy to now bring about this reconciliation. There's a responsibility with each and every South African to live it, as Dr. Wessels was saying, and to become part of the process. And just to get back also to the Afrikaner groups and to Afrikaans as a language, as the Institute, we support freedom of choice when it comes to your house or the language you speak or where you send your child to school. That's what we support and call for. And so we feel that multilingualism is extremely important in South Africa. But we also think that if there are Afrikaans people who feel strongly about Afrikaans, that's great. But we also don't agree with the nationalism that comes with it, the almost wanting to pull themselves into a law again and not become part of it. And by becoming part of it, it doesn't mean you're going to lose your right to speak the language of your choice.
Okay. As we close, Mr. Mabasa, are you willing to reconcile?
I'm human, and being human, it means I cannot live in isolation. But I wanted to make one comment about the framework that continue to perpetuate minorities in South Africa. It also was not accidental. Actually, the political leaders of the time, starting with Nelson Mandela, they drummed and over-drummed the issue of minorities until the so-called minorities came to believe that they were an issue different from all South Africans.
Okay, I must stop you right there because we've run out of time, unfortunately. That was question time for today. A big thank you to my guests and to you for watching the show. Your feedback via email, questiontime@sabc.co.za, or Twitter handle @questiontime24. From me and the crew, have yourself a wonderful time. Goodbye.